All right. Well, welcome everyone. This is the Rotary Club of Worldwide Impact, and we're excited to share our mission and the work we do as part of Rotary International with you today. My name is Sam Kendall, and I'm your host for today's program. Just up top, want to let you know, for those who don't, Rotary International is a global network of 1.4 million neighbors, friends, leaders, and problem solvers in more than 46,000 clubs. We're all united by the common goal of making a positive impact in our communities worldwide. As a Rotary Club, we at Rotary Club Worldwide Impact approach every conversation as an opportunity to learn and grow together. And our goal is to connect with and hear from fascinating and inspiring speakers, often with a message focused on the power of ideas to change lives and ultimately the world. And we hope also bring a little inspiration that allows you to think about how you personally can make a difference as well. Now, some of you may be hearing this on your favorite podcast, and some of you may be watching on our YouTube channel or viewing it on our club's website. If you do enjoy this program, we do ask that you share it with a friend. It's always nice. And then also leave us a good rating. We really like those 5 stars. So let's get started with today. Today, we're honored to have with us Jörn Fleck. Jörn Fleck serves as the Senior Director with the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council, with primary responsibility for the Center's European Union efforts and programming related to Western Europe, Brexit, and EU trade relations. Jörn also leads outreach to US and European legislatures, as well as the Council's Transatlantic Digital Project, which seeks to promote closer US EU cooperation on digital policy matters. Though we've been trying to get Jörn to talk with our Rotary Club for a while, having him with us today is timely for many of our club, which spans both sides of the Atlantic and more around the world. So we're all curious to hear his perspective on the current US EU relationship, and we can't wait for you all to hear it too. So please sit back, relax, and get ready to hopefully be inspired. Uh, Thank you again, Jörn, for joining us today. Let's get started. So just from the top, can you briefly describe what the Atlantic Council is and what you and your team do at the Atlantic Council?
Yeah, thank you so much, first of all, for having me, Sam, and colleagues. We're very much looking forward to the conversation and hopefully also having a little bit of a Q&A and back and forth here with everyone later on. Briefly describe the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council is a foreign policy think tank based in Washington, D.C. We like to think of ourselves as DC based, but not DC centric. And I'll explain that a little bit more. The Atlantic Council came out of a NATO tradition, was founded by former secretaries of state, secretaries of defense, and other administration officials and political leaders in the early 1960s, really to promote awareness among the American public about why U.S. engagement in Europe, why U.S. membership in NATO serves U.S. interests and is a key asset for the United States. And the Atlantic Council, even back in the 60s and 70s, ran some of the first public awareness campaigns, including with U.S. sports stars, to really try and connect with different audiences, even back then, and explain why U.S. engagement in Europe and globally then later on really matters to the United States and brings value to the United States. Since those early days, NATO and transatlantic security and European security is still very much in our DNA and at the heart of what many of my colleagues do, but we have grown a little bit since then. From one program in the early 1960s and 6 programs when our current president CEO took over in 2006, to now 16 programs and centers that cover both regional issues and functional themes. So in my case, I head up the Europe Center. We're focused on US-EU relations, Europe, the bilateral relationships between the United States and, say, France, Germany, the UK, Poland, Italy, go down the list. And I have colleagues that work specifically on Latin America, on South East Asia, on Ukraine, Russia, on Africa. But I also have colleagues that work on thematic issues in programs that focus, for example, on digital, on disinformation in the digital space, or a digital forensics research lab that was one of the first to move into this space, and we can talk more about that. Discovered, Russian little green man and linked them back through social media accounts to the Russian armed forces when Russia first invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea. I have colleagues focusing on global energy, on technology issues, and so on and so forth. We have grown in numbers as well. I think when I joined in 2013, we're around 80. We're 260 staff, full-time staff now. We have offices not just in the United States, but also in Europe and other places. And really, I think one thing that sets the council apart is really a very you spoke of problem solvers, right? And your network of problem solvers. And I think the image of think tanks is always that, we do great analysis and spend much time admiring the problems of the world. I think that's a first good step. Good analysis, good thinking is a first good step. It shouldn't be the last step also, right? And that's where the council is very much more policy focused and wants to engage, influence, and shape U.S. and allied policy in tackling the global challenges that face both the United States and its partners around the world. And how we do that, we can go into more detail, but that is through our writing, through our convening, through building communities of influence, of stakeholders from different backgrounds and in different spheres around specific issues. And happy to talk through some of this in more detail. But really the focus and what binds all of us at the council is that we believe in U.S. engagement, constructive engagement, and the U.S. role in the world together with allies and partners. And given our name and where we came from and our DNA at the council, obviously Europe and our European partners are among the first among those allies and partners. I'll stop here, Sam.
Right. Great. Thank you so much, Jörn. That's, I think, a really great kind of overlay of where the Atlantic Council came from and kind of the work that you currently do as well. So I'm going to open it up for questions, but I do have two questions at the top, one of which is mine, and then one of which was one that was sent to me. So the first one is, so you focus a lot in your current position on US, EU, UK relations. What is something that might not be, there's a lot of news that's top of the fold, right? Like big banner headline news right now in EU, US, UK relations. But do you think that there's something that is not top of the news that you think should be a point of focus for those of us who are citizens living in these countries and around the world?
Yeah, look, you already alluded to it. I think we're seeing sort of obviously the immediate major global challenges around Russia's continued war in Ukraine and the U.S. administration's approach to that. That takes up a lot of bandwidth and attention for people. I think that obviously follow the news and are interested in these matters, but also have important lives to lead and other things to do, right? So that takes up a lot of attention and rightfully so. I think on a day like today, March 12th, when we've seen U.S. tariffs snap back on steel and aluminum, and being increased in the case of aluminum on imports, including from the European Union, maybe those top level trade and economic issues are taking up a lot of attention. Um, I think what gets missed in much of this is just how integrated we are at a political level, at an economic level, at a firm and business level, at a cultural and social levels, just how strong those linkages are and how strong the exchanges between the two sides of the Atlantic are. I think we take that for granted, as we tend to do with those closest to us. We have higher expectations of each other, and that means for more emotional reactions when things don't go the way we expect them to go. We expect
Mhm.
our respective counterparts to act on the US or the European side. And I think just thinking through those linkages and the level of integration we have between the two sides, that I think we tend to forget in the day to day, or even as people that travel on a regular basis, or have been to the United States, have been to Europe, uh, um, more than a few times, and so I think just really reminding ourselves of that level of integration that we see in our work lives, that we see in our cultural and social lives, that we see in so many different respects, and I think that is not top of mind for many people, even though they come into contact with some form of that integration on almost a
Mhm.
daily basis. And then there's
Yeah, that's
obviously technical issues that, if you're really into digital and tech regulation, then, the three-letter acronyms of DMA, DSA, and those kind of things, DSTs. All right. So platform regulation, regulation of disinformation and hate speech, or digital services taxes, those things I think simmer under the sort of top level newsworthiness, but are nonetheless really important for the lifeblood of our transatlantic economy, of how our companies interact, how we, as individuals consume digital products. I think the questions about security and defense integration, defense industrial issues
Mhm.
that are sort of these are all issues we can talk about that are just under the surface of the top level news that most people will get about this really important relationship.
That's great, and would agree from the Rotary perspective with kind of those linkages between Europe and the United States and North America in general. Just our Rotary Club is a great example of that. We're all kind of from the different parts of the world, but a lot of us are from either North America or Europe and have connections there. But I think also our exchange programming that we have and some of our other work that we do as well. We did have one other question that I received, and that's kind of looking at the European Commission's white paper on defense that is going to be coming out. Obviously, uh, with the current situation and the administration's different policy outlooks on U.S. Ukraine and possibly also Europe in general. What do you think the implications for the European Commission's white paper on defense will be? I know this is a much more technical question than the previous one.
No, that's okay. I think it links into a much bigger question, right? I think we're seeing a fundamental questioning by this new administration of the relationship between the United States and Europe, and a questioning of what role the United States should or should not have and continue in terms of U.S. engagement in transatlantic and specifically in European security. And we're seeing demands for Europe, and have seen those actually across previous administrations, U.S. administrations, for much greater European burden sharing for Europe to really step up and take much greater responsibility and pay for its own defense. And we can have that conversation. And I think what we've seen since President Trump's return to the White House now, what is it, 7 weeks or so ago, is a realization and really a final wake up call. I don't really like that term because I think Europe has been snoozing through enough wake up calls and has hit the snooze button often enough. And I say that as a European. Um, I think we've really seen a stark realization and finally an internalization on the European side that Europe really has to step up. And that has been a process over the last year or so, I would say, even when we had the change of the European Commission in December, but the whole lead up of the political transition, I think there were two big themes, obviously. One was European economic competitiveness for the next European term as a top political priority. The other one was security and defense and what role Europe needs to play. That's always
Mhm.
been a touchy subject because many in the United States obviously have seen and for example, our British partners always insisted on NATO being the only forum for U.S. European security and defense conversations, but also real cooperation. And I think we're seeing a change and a significant shift there with this proposed new 150 billion euro defense fund that would leverage joint borrowing at the EU level um, in order to pay for Europe to step up and develop a truly European pillar of defense, and then that using that to leverage up to 800 billion over several years in order to really close years and years of underinvestment in many countries and some real strategic capability gaps. I think it's an important development. I think this is long overdue. Happy to discuss this with participants here more. I think on the US side, that will require some changes as well. I always tell my American colleagues and friends, um, they tend to have a slightly schizophrenic reaction to Europeans talking about stepping up because it's a constant push of Europe do more, Europe take on greater burden sharing, Europe step up your capabilities, step up your investment on security and defense. And then when you talk about even pretty mediocre sums or levels of ambition, it's a well, not that way, and only the way we wanted you to step up. And I think that's another dimension of this relationship that will come up and as Europe tries to step up. A lot of this, when it comes to the white papers in the details, I do think the EU has a key role to play here because we're really talking about defense industrial efforts and
Mm.
investment on that front. I think the EU is much better placed than NATO to actually drive forward some synergies, some joint efforts at a European level. And we'll see what the white paper. I mean, next week we have the big European Council UCO meeting where member states will have to, you know, uh, um, decide how they want to take this forward and how they want to
Yeah.
instruct and give a mandate to the European Commission to take this forward. And then a lot of this will be in the devil will be in the detail, but looking very much forward to, I think this is a net positive and Europe, this is long overdue for Europe. But happy to discuss this further with your participants as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great deep dive, I think, into these pieces. And I know there's a lot of moving parts, especially with the European Council and the EU in general this year. As an apolitical think tank, what do you think about the level of information and disinformation available to the general public right now? And how is your think tank kind of working against that disinformation piece? You had touched on it briefly in your introduction.
Yeah, look, I think a really important and challenging issue. How we in today's world dominated by social media, and that's how many people, especially among younger generations, um, consume the news and get their information. Um, I think we've seen the negative impacts already around so many recent major themes and issues that have confronted both sides of the Atlantic, starting with the pandemic. I mean, I wouldn't say starting with one example being the COVID-19 pandemic, where we really saw a spike as everyone was sitting at home, and social media interaction being one of the main forms of interaction we had as an opportunity during at least the initial lockdown periods. Um, we've seen this around obviously important elections. We've seen this around Russia's not just full-scale invasion. Also, I mentioned our digital forensics research lab and its work around the initial Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and the lead up even. Um, Look, I think that's a major issue and there I don't think they're easy fixes. They're not just in the regulation. I think that's where obviously the United States and Europe have gone slightly different directions, with Europe taking much more um, regulatory based approach. Also having, I think important to remember in that case, having
Hmm.
slightly different definitions of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, even if the underlying principles are the same. I think the day-to-day and the legal manifestation of freedom of speech is slightly different in freedom of speech rules and laws are slightly different between the United States and Europe. That plays into this. I think what we have done on the Atlantic Council side, really our DFR lab, having researchers around the world that work in different languages that directly try to counter disinformation, trace certain narratives, where they come from, which actors
Hmm.
are involved, and trying to, from a research side, provide much more clarity on some of these actors, but also the narratives and tracking that. And I think if you look at their work or the work of organizations like Bellingcat and
Hmm.
others, you have some really impressive research being done. I think there is a regulatory side of things. I already mentioned the Digital Services Act and other regulation at the EU level that holds platforms responsible to some degree for policing the content, at least for European consumers and participants in social media. And then I think there's a general challenge of how we conduct political discourse with one another, at every level, not just at the national or international level, but um, that we remind ourselves and teach our children and teach or remind ourselves on a constant basis that it's worth doing a little bit of critical thinking and developing the tools to do that and the muscle memory to do that and not
Hmm.
passively take on at face value everything we are bombarded with once you go on any form of social media. So I don't think there's sort of one easy, if we can only knock out the Russians or Chinese on this or that, or just the
Hmm.
whatever troll farm, we'd be, or we can regulate the platform. So we can, I don't think there's
Yeah.
one easy fix. There's always multiple things we need to be thinking and doing about this, including at all levels, societal, government, educational, and so on.
And person to person as well from
And
your
person to
your
person.
comment.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I wanted to call on JP Matos Diaz, who had a follow-up question as well.
Yes, thanks, Sam, and thank you, Jörn, for being available. Great to hear your thoughts. So I have a follow-up question on what you mentioned earlier. So I think you did allude to the fact that there is definitely a gap in terms of decision, or I say event analysis and decision taking between the U.S. Current administration, at least, and the collective European administration. And my question to you, and it kind of ties up to the previous question, is um, how do you see the current step up that you alluded to being shown? I mean, how could one actually see that? Because when you mention that, you do have your think tank that produces lots of papers, but in the end, all of these materials will be read by highly interested individuals who will have their personal time from their personal lives dedicated to those topics that interest them. But to the general public that might be bombarded by the likes of social media and others, it might be very difficult to see, where does the truth really lie? Thought less about having the critical time and capacity to analyze, is it something that I should take at face value? My question is, the EU step up you mentioned, how is that? What is the direction that is being taken really? Because I at least cannot see it.
What direction is that? And thank you, JP, for the question. Just to clarify, in what direction is sort of the EU stepping up, not just on security and defense, but geopolitically, in what direction is that taken? In what sense do you
In
mean
terms of
that?
closing that gap between
Oh,
decision, event analysis and decision taking, because this is what you alluded to prior to my previous question.
yeah. Look, I think fundamentally, it's really important to get, on the one hand, to get the technical side of things right. You need the resourcing for it. Our former president, our former board chairman, who was Jim Jones, who served as Marine Corps commander. He was the national security advisor early on in the Obama administration. Um, he was SACEUR, so the Supreme Allied Commander for NATO forces in Europe. He always reminds us that uh, vision without resources is hallucination. So the very first thing that Europe needs to get right is actually put its money where its mouth is. Um, you can talk about a European Union as a global actor or a geopolitical actor or a geopolitical commission under the first von der Leyen commission, right? If you don't put the actual resources where you're trying to go and trying to get and the behind the capabilities that you're trying to build up, then I think all of this is just talk. And so I think it's an important thing that happened here in the announcements that we saw coming out of the European Commission, but also the potential shift we're seeing in Germany as the largest member state in the European Union, right, with its renewed or adjusting the so-called debt brake and rearming or putting a lot more resources and money into rearming. Um, I think these are important first steps. So that's get the resources behind this. Then you need to really work out the details of how you encourage scale up. I mean, I don't know how familiar people here are with the Mario Draghi report at the European level on European competitiveness. But one of the key points this former Italian prime minister and European Central Bank president made was that in Europe, everyone is just too small. We focus so much on integrating the single market and ensuring competition amongst ourselves that we haven't really thought about scale up. So we have all of these small players in Europe, and you see that also in the in the defense industry of Europe, and how European countries in very small badges keep you know really small capability niches and over subsidize them. I mean, the comparison is always between the number of weapons platforms that the US uses in the sort of 35 range, right? And then you have hundreds on the European at the European level, which makes cooperation, joint operations, and interoperability very hard. It also makes all of these defense firms, or a lot of them, I should say, not all, but a lot of them not very competitive in a global setting or even a European setting. And so I think A, putting the resources behind it, B, creating the right framework conditions for some consolidation, for some integration at the European level, at the defense industrial level. And then ultimately, a lot of this is about leadership. I mean, I think what we've seen in Europe is, I should say, leadership and political will, right? I mean, with the political situation, I don't need to tell the Europeans here on the call, but with the situation in France and Germany over the last few years and the absolute absence of leadership, um, and inward focus on small domestic challenges, that will not allow Europe to step up. And as long as you don't have the true political will, you can credibly communicate that. You have a conversation with your own populations about why this is necessary, why Europe needs to step up, why it's in Europe's interest, and not just something you do to please this or that US president or this or that US Congress. Having that conversation with a sense of leadership, I think if you have those three ingredients, and I'm a little bit more confident over the last few weeks and months that Europe can actually get there this time. But I think those are the three things that I would watch. So leadership, political will, the resourcing, and then actually the technical details of implementing a European initiative on the defense industrial and military cooperation side of things. So I hope that answers your question roughly, JP.
It does. It does. I would have still a follow-up on that one. And Sam, I'll leave the floor open for others as well, of course. But on that particular aspect of defense, I do agree that at some point you would have to start building up and translating, positions into actual investments, because otherwise it's just talks indeed. That being said, a powerful industry like defense, is not built up within 1 year alone, right? So the U.S. defense industry has been building up for years, probably much more than the one in Europe, and for strategic reasons, right? That is obvious. But well, happy to hear your thoughts. But still, the fact is that we have a U.S. defense industry that is much more capable than the one that you have in Europe. So with that investment being made, how long do you think it will take to be really comparable between these two entities, and taking into account that in the end you have U.S. That is acting as just one country, and as mentioned earlier, Europe is still a set of countries. So happy to hear your thoughts on how investing today will actually lead to
Look,
a comparable.
I wouldn't overstate how capable U.S. defense industry is. I mean, what you've seen is a consolidation. So you have fewer but bigger players, right, over the last 20 plus years or so. But if you look at the ability to produce, for example, ammunition for, artillery ammunition, yes, the capacity is higher, but there's still nowhere near what the United States would need to, A, backfill what the U.S. has delivered to Ukraine, and B, to actually live up to the sustainment levels so what you have in stock at the end of the day to fight a war anywhere near the rates of ammunition use that we're seeing by both sides in Russia's war against Ukraine and invasion of Ukraine. So it's not everything is perfect, and the U.S. players are on this next level compared to Europe. Europe, as I said, has to deal with a level of fragmentation. That means we have lots of little players, and even our big players are small compared to U.S. players. If you think of Leonardo or Rheinmetall or Group Naval Group, I guess, in France, and so on and so forth, right? You have a much more fragmented landscape, and that's what I meant. That also will matter, like how you set the targets and benchmarks and incentives in what you're about to spend in this defense industrial effort, defense joint borrowing initiative that the Commission has put on the table. That will
Hmm.
matter. And we will have to live with much greater European integration. And that is something that I think in general, because we haven't had that conversation, we haven't had a European framing through political leadership and political will at the European level for a long time of how Europe is really our way forward on a number of issues. That doesn't mean I'm blind to EU regulatory overreach and gold plating at the national member state level and all of the challenges that we can discuss. But there's a great quote, all European countries are small, some just haven't realized it yet. And I think it's very important to keep that in mind when we look at a geopolitical setting where Europe just risks being left behind, ignored at best. And
Hmm.
if you're not at the table, you're on the table. So
Definitely.
I think to your question, I don't have a good answer, but I do think the challenge of the moment is so clear. And as Europe, as the Europeans will know, Europe has always been forged in crisis. And if this isn't a crisis to forge something, I don't know what.
Fair enough. Thanks.
Great, great question, and thank you, Jorn, for that very detailed analysis. I do want to open up the possibility if there's anyone else who currently has a question for Jorn before I take it back with a few other questions. We do have one in the chat.
Written, yeah.
I don't know if it's a question necessarily, but at the moment it seems that tariffs are going up on both sides of the Atlantic. What is the risk the ties between both sides are becoming looser because of it, especially with the news coming out today on that topic?
Yeah, look, I mean, first of all, things will become more expensive for everyone on each side of the Atlantic. Um, I think there's, really, as I said at the beginning, and one response to one of the first questions, the level of integration of the transatlantic economy, I think, is not really clear to many decision makers on either side. I would say, especially on the U.S. side at the moment. We're talking, if you count in trade and investment, we're talking about an $8 trillion relationship between the United States and its European partners. That includes, I believe, the UK. It's not just US EU. And if you consider German GDP, that's about it's just under half of, I believe, EU GDP. That's just under double German GDP. I mean, that's the level of the relationship we're talking about. Um, and that's why these tariffs are, I think we're shooting ourselves in the foot, and we'll have third parties laughing and filling the gap in many cases, and not for the better, not actors that I believe either the United States nor Europe really want to model their own future on. And that's, specifically referring to China. The risk is there. I don't think supply chains are not that flexible that you can just pick them up and change them, at least not in the business that most US and European firms are in the higher ends and the more complex uh, um, industries or products that we're talking about. I think that's something we've already seen with all this talk about de-risking and friendshoring and nearshoring and reshoring, the actual shifts in supply chains or value chains are not that easily implemented. They take years. And so I think I think even business decision makers will watch this space and see where US trade policy and then the European reaction goes. I don't think that's a decision for I mean, it's not a short-term decision, right? The other factors to keep in mind in this respect, Andreas, I clearly are how much there is to President Trump's stated intention of this being a transitional period, which I think refers to really an attempt by this administration or philosophy that it can fundamentally reshape not just U.S. engagement in the global economy and force reindustrialization in the United States, force industries and supply chains to come home to the United States, but also to remake the global trading system that the US and Europe especially built over the last few decades. And, much will depend on how much this administration means that and how much it can really influence and reshape those relations and the global system. I think the jury on that is out. This idea that, yeah, we just have to endure a little bit of short-term economic pain for some long-term gain. I'm not sure our very complex global economy quite works that way. But, it's a matter of so how that plays out in the next few weeks, months, and 4 years.
Great point. I'm sure if we asked you back in 2 months, we could have an even longer conversation about that question. But I'm gonna just have two more questions, one from the chat, and then I have one to kind of finish us off here, Jörn, with respect for your time. So the last one from the chat is, how do you think the privatization of traditional services such as internet and information is altering the landscape of international democracy for the better or worse, and to be effective government allies on a global scale? This individual is thinking about the impact of Starlink, the privatization of space travel, and how that's impacting people more generally, and people of country increasingly upended by one individual's pursuit or visions versus another individual's pursuit or vision. There's a lot of questions within those two questions, but
That's a really interesting question. I think you're already seeing a lot more attention being paid to that, right? With forced by upon the Europeans and a discussion around a French company, I think Eutelsat, that is sort of could bridge the gap potentially if this has come up in recent weeks in terms of the very public fallout between President Trump and President Zelensky of Ukraine, and the restriction of military and intelligence assistance to Ukraine, and how much Ukraine has depended on Starlink, and whether Europe needs to think about an over-reliance on US technology providers, right? I think you've seen that come up in that respect. I don't think that's an easy answer. I also personally don't think Europe can. So you really need to do an assessment of and a prioritization of your dependencies, right? If you're trying, I mean, that's also the problem with I think this talk of de-risking in general. Like I think we really need to prioritize. You won't have the resources or the political will or the capabilities to tackle all of these things. So where are we most exposed in terms of both the United States and Europe, where are we most exposed in certain areas? What matters most to us, whether that's economically, in terms of our political system, in terms of democratic norms and processes, in terms of our security and defense, and then you need to prioritize. I mean, even Starlink, you don't build overnight, right? This is a multi-year effort. It goes back to JP's point or question, right? And of course, we're talking about longer term time horizons. Um, I think in terms of communications and the internet, an open internet, and there, I think Europe has made some steps. I'm not sure that I would agree with every single regulatory approach, but the idea that you need to tackle an over-reliance or hold certain actors responsible is generally, I think, the right direction. And then you can obviously talk about how you fine-tune and implement and fine-tune, I should say. Um, on space travel, I'm really not enough of an expert, but even there, again, you see, I mean, is that a problem for our democracy? If they democratize prices very quickly and I can go very soon, then I'm all for it. But joking aside, um, I think you're seeing that conversation already. I mean, with the European efforts to build competitive capabilities in order not to have to rely on SpaceX, for example, to deploy European intelligence and communications satellites. We just saw that, I think, last week, right?
Mhm.
I think these are all important questions. I think really, given how much Europe has underinvested in many of these technology areas, um, I think you really need to figure out a priority list. Um, what capabilities are most important or most make you most vulnerable? Again, not just in an economic sense, but in a social and democratic and in a security and defense sense. And I think that's a difficult thing to do. But I think the awareness levels in Europe are you know have advanced so much compared to even 5 or 10 years ago on these questions. I hope that was sort of an answer. I think it's really difficult. Again, I'm always a skeptic when it comes to just blaming everything on, you saw in, for example, with the German election, you saw someone trying to use their huge bullhorn, social media bullhorn, to influence the German election and hold interviews with far right decision makers. And the impact was not really detectable, right? In the case of Elon Musk interviewing Alice Weidel. Um, so I think as I said, I think the second or third answer to the second or third question, there's always a lot of different strategies and buttons you have to push. If it was on all of these challenging issues, if there ever were sort of one singular solution, I think we'd all be much better off. That's not what I think decision makers or publics want to hear, but it's, I think, a better way to start thinking about the issue sets and the problem sets, and then also the solutions.
Thank you, Jorn. I know we've had a lot of very high level conversations during this talk, so I want to kind of bring it back more to individual basis here, because we as Rotarians, we call ourselves people of action. And so I kind of want to ask you, from your point of view, what are some of the most important things that we as general citizens on both sides of the Atlantic and beyond, because we do have people from Australia on the call and from elsewhere, what can we do to help kind of increase the cooperation and coordination between our countries, but also our governments?
That's a good question. I think, look, you're already doing this in a way right now in many ways, right? You're you have built this network where you're talking to each other, you're exchanging on issues, international issues that matter to you. You're trying to figure out how you contribute to solving problems and doing that around the world, expressing that interest in the political processes of your respective countries. I think, of course, I mean, we always hear in the United States how far down foreign policy issues are, but that's also a very traditional conception of foreign policy. I think as the sort of top level high politics is, I'm guessing, a little bit of an old term for it. I mean, you have cities being much more engaged in international diplomacy, talking to other city and municipal level decision makers on anything from urban planning to, green transition, decarbonization, clean technology, social issues. I think everyone can sort of try and get involved in that, at least if you live in larger metropolitan areas. You have international economic issues that you can make an issue as you engage in your network. I think a lot of this is building the networks and then seeing what are the common issues we face and what can we learn from each other in terms of solutions. I mean, that is, I think, one of the most underrated aspects of, for example, the European Union, just constantly being exposed to, hey, this is how these guys deal with very similar issues that we also face at our club level, at our city level, at our state level, at our country level, in our sector, in this interest group, and really continuing to push that out and try and get to new audiences that, not having this sort of very traditional view of, oh, it's just sort of the European Council or the US EU summit or the NATO summit that can take forward solutions to international issues. Like, you guys are doing this day to day, so like keep doing what you're doing and find new people to engage and bring into that. I think that would be my starting point, and sort of
Yeah.
shedding this, you're a passive viewer uh um in front of your cell phone, your iPad, or your television screen. If you're excited or concerned about something, find an outlet, find ways to engage other people around it, and you're doing that. If we can ever be helpful from an Atlantic Council side, it's always our goal to go. I hate this term, to go beyond the Beltway, because that's a very narrow horizon to set ourselves, but or a
Yeah.
very a limited horizon. But
Yeah, considering none of us here are in the Beltway, I think you've gone beyond the Beltway with this
hey,
conversation. I really want to thank you, Jorn, and thank you everyone for joining us, and for those of you who asked questions. For those of you who are not already involved in Rotary, if you've been inspired to get involved and make a difference in your community, we invite you to learn more about Rotary International and also the Rotary Club of Worldwide Impact. With that being said, I would sincerely like to thank Jörn Fleck for being here with us. And I would like to turn it back to him if he has any last words that he'd like to give. Otherwise, thank you all. And we look forward to having you join us once again in the very near future.
huge thank you, Sam, and to all of those joining and submitting questions, asking questions. I meant what I said. Sam has my contact details if people here want to reach out, if I can ever be helpful in connecting not just my own team, but other colleagues on other issues here at the council with you, with anyone who has a specific interest. Follow up with. Sorry, Sam, to put you on the spot, but please do reach out.
But
You can also find me on the Atlantic Council website, and very much hope this was of interest, and look forward to hopefully doing this again at some point whenever it's helpful. And thank you again for joining today.